Okay. All right. So, can everybody hear me? I'm here.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we're gonna I have a presentation here that kind of is like it's a survey of Azure AD security, both from an offensive and defensive perspective. It goes into detail about some of the architecture of Azure AD and its implications with Azure overall. And yeah, so we'll go into what Azure AD is, its components, some of the security implications, some security best practices, some types of attacks that go on, and you'll based on Dan's presentation, you probably have a little flavor of some of the things and what type of monitoring and controls you can work on. But so we'll get into it and we'll discuss it. So Azure AD, it has everything has an attack surface, and Azure AD as well as Azure typically has an external attack surface, which is its interactions through like Office 365, through authentications that happen. It's always online, always available. It's not behind a firewall. It's not internal. It's the base URLs are out there for interacting with it. So pretty much anybody on the internet has access to Azure AD. Whether they have access to users in your instances, that's a different story, but ultimately it's just out in the open. So it does have that external attack surface. Now, once you get into authenticated, then there's some internal objects that are exposed based on your permissions, and those are like different resources that it controls. Both in itself, as in like permission and role objects, as well as stuff that's in Azure itself, like different resources like storage and things like that, virtual machines, instances. And then it also has an API, a very robust API, which pretty much control everything, both in Azure AD and Azure, from like REST API. There's PowerShell modules available that could completely automate everything. So yeah, so we'll touch on that as well. So what are Azure AD objects? These are typically what's in the Azure AD infrastructure to store data store and its operational capability. You've got it's pretty much houses all your users in your cloud environment, all the groups, and all the kind of like security management around your cloud environment. Also knows about all the applications that in the environment, in your particular instance. Has a lot of configuration and say about what access those applications have, who controls them, who you share them with. It's all pretty much configured in Azure AD. There's these things called service principals, which are basically they're kind of like the service accounts. They're users that control applications, and the application's ability to talk to other services and stuff, what permissions, who can access them, or what it can do in automated workflows is controlled by service principals. Then there's devices, which are in part of enrolled devices in your organization that are part of part of the directory. And then there's the roles, which lets you like group permissions and then attach them to users and groups. So that's kind of the basic object structure. So in users and groups, there's a standard identity for users, and that's there's an external version of this identity, and then there's an external version as well. And that's kind of the basic structure of the internal and external identity object. Basically identity references for like users. Then there's groups, and then there's just logical collections of users. They can be nested, and they can have members that are not owners of that group. So you can have somebody own the control of a group, and then have members who can't do anything with that group other than be a member of it and share its permissions. There's this thing called Azure AD Applications, and really what an Azure AD application is the actual template for a service principal for authentication. Now, anytime you create an application in Azure, it also creates a service principal in Azure AD for the identity and access management for that application. The applications can be single or multi-tenant. So as Dan touched on a little bit, you can have external applications that give you access, as well as internal applications that reside solely in your Azure environment. So as I just said, multi-tenant apps reside in the tenant they were created in, but service principals are always in the target tenant. So there's an object ID, which represents the application itself, and then there's an application ID, which is very specific to these service principals. And so those are the kind of things you want to keep an eye on. These objects IDs, these application IDs, and then the permissions that the service principals have and where they reside. So an Azure AD Service Principal is an instance of an application somewhere. It's basically a service account. It can have a password and also can have a certificate for authentication. If you create a service principal in Azure, you will also create a corresponding application. So you'll see an application, and because they kind of go hand in hand, the service principals and applications. You can have your devices in there as well. You can actually join the device, and that's because part of a sort of an organizational resource. And then you can also register a device, and that for external users which are not corporate owned, but they want to take part in some services you're offering. And then there's the roles, and then this is where permissions are grouped for objects. So they're basically a container with a bunch of permissions. There's a whole bunch of predefined built-in roles that have certain permissions. You can customize roles as well, but this is where you can get into trouble, because the roles, if you create custom roles, you may assign permissions that expose things and accidentally, and so it's custom roles have to be vetted very, very, very carefully. So AAD role permissions, they have a namespace, they have an object in the namespace, and properties. There's sometimes people put in sensitive data in the role properties, so that's something to look out for. We'll touch briefly on that as well. So as part of this Azure infrastructure, we've got the Azure Resource Manager, which basically controls the resources in Azure, and it basically manages resources. It gives you the functionality to deploy resources, and it's basically controlled by Azure AD. The identity and access capability resides in Azure AD, and then Azure Resource Manager is sort of the where everything, all the actual resources themselves and the functionality to interact with those resources is implemented. So we've got ability to manage, create VMs, databases, storage, and then there's serverless, like sort of applications that just run in Azure and interact with different resources without VMs. Some of the terms in Azure Resource Manager, there's the tenant, which is the overall organization, which is your organization. Then there's a subscription, which is kind of how it's monetized with an account, and then each one of those accounts is a collection of resource groups, and that's where the resources are stored. So a tenant could have multiple subscriptions, multiple resource groups under different accounts, different payment. So that's kind of the basic structure. A resource group is just a container for resources like storage accounts, VMs, network objects, that kind of stuff. Yeah, resources is a managed item inside a resource group, and then the resource provider is basically a service that provides the type of resource, and then RBAC is how it's kind of all the permissions are tied together, and that's controlled by Azure AD. As part of like the base security concern is when attackers come and try to infiltrate or an environment is they want to discover what you have available and what your assets are, and the initial way to go about it is to sort of enumerate users, and it's quite easy to actually enumerate users because these URLs are online. There's scripts available that they can run. We can run these scripts, and they can tell whether the user exists or not. So just online at any time, most of your users can be enumerated fairly easily. So just something to be aware of. It's completely these URLs are completely exposed, and people probably are, trying to enumerate stuff all the time. So that's why it's important to have a good, identity management policy, and we'll get into that. There's the Azure is kind of separated into a control and data plane. Control plane is the actual management of resources, creating resources, deleting them. Data plane is the is sort of the interaction with the resource. So that's where the data flows within or without a resource. This is ARM RBAC. And this is, I'm just kind of going into the structure of everything and how it all fits together before we get into more of the security stuff. So this is a ARM RBAC, which is, again, all these roles are in Azure AD. It's an authorization system for Azure resources. Like I said, groups of collection of permissions. You've got the RBAC role, which is the role. Then that's tied to a security principal, which is all an Azure AD object, and then you got users, groups, service principals, and managed identity as well. And then the role definition, of course, is the collection of permissions, as we said before. So how do you interact with Azure AD? There's as you can see, there's quite a bunch of ways to do that, right? You can just go into the UI and through the portal. There's a CLI, which is written in Python, and then you get an access. You can authenticate, you get an access token, and then you can interact with Azure AD using the CLI. There's a bunch of PowerShell modules that let you interact with the Azure infrastructure in general. Then there's a specific set of PowerShell objects. It's a library called Azure AD, interacts with the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph is actually the actual implementation of Azure AD. It's a graph structure that contains all the objects and the organizational structure and permissions, all that is stored in there. So when you're interacting with Azure AD, you're actually interacting with this data structure called the Microsoft Graph, and then everything is available there for interaction with if you're authenticated. Then there's an older MD Online, which is an older library, which is still works, and then all the rest of the APIs are actually documented online at URL. So as you can see, there's a lot of ways for people to interact with Azure AD, and not just required by the UI. The APIs are exposed to anybody with an access token that's valid. So it requires you to have be in a position where you kind of know what's happening in your environment, because it's so accessible at being on the internet. And so how do people find out about the users in your Azure AD environment? There's quite a robust set of tooling out there for people to use. I know we touched a little bit on it in just the past slide, but yeah, here's some links for tooling and techniques. This is basic user enumeration can be done right at the OAuth link. There's a password spraying toolkit called MSOL Spray, which has a lot of functionality for enumerating users. There's also a way to there's some tooling around finding people's OneDrives, and then there's some tooling around just general enumeration of cloud resources, which also has user enumeration capabilities. So basically, the strategy is to discover a set of identities that are available in your Azure AD environment, and then try to get a valid credential for one of these entities, and then begin to see what type of access and resource manipulation capability there is. So touch a little bit on what's password spraying, and this is basically a way to get around like lockout policies. But what happens is basically MSOL sprays is a very popular toolkit for performing this. And basically, it just sends a test password to a possible account name, and then does it like maybe you could set the time, but it's like every maybe 15 minutes, sometimes every hour, just right under the most common lockout policies, so that it flies under the radar. You still get a failed authentication in the logs, so that's something to monitor. But it can find out whether these things. It can find out whether you have a valid credential, whether you have MFA enabled, whether the tenant exists, whether the user exists, the account is locked, the account is disabled, the password is expired. So it can give you an attacker quite a bit of information about the users in the environment. And so this is done over a long extended period, so that flies under the radar, and then at some point the hope is to get some valid account that you can proceed with. And there's some other tools as well that has similar functionality, and that's kind of listed over there. So Azure AD passwords. So basically, there's some capability you may want to implement called Azure AD banned password policy, which you could implement both in the Azure environment, and also if you have your Windows domain environment connected with Azure, you can also it can also become available in your local environment, your local Windows domain environment, which is very nice. There's a link there for some best practices in protecting yourself against password spraying. And the interesting thing to note about password spraying, and this is statistics directly from Microsoft, this analysis of compromises. Nearly 100% of password spray attacks which are successful use legacy authentication. So all the users in the environment that are using like POP3, IMAP, etc. The interesting thing is MFA doesn't work against legacy authentication. So even though the user maybe authenticate via MFA and it's configured that way, if they use any of these legacy authentication methods to get data, that does not require MFA. So you can just keep on trying access using those protocols for that particular user, and eventually see if something can be compromised, which means that modernization of password policy is very, very important, that you have a strong password policy in place for your Azure environment because of this. This is just some statistics for 1 month in 2019. This is from Microsoft's analysis of their, because they analyze compromised accounts in the Azure environment, and on July of 2019, 122,000 accounts were compromised just from password spraying alone. And this statistic is pretty much it fluctuates even today between 120 and 200,000 accounts per month. So as you can see, it's a pretty serious issue. Now that you can block legacy authentication if you don't need it, you in Exchange Online or in your Exchange mail at your Exchange mailbox level, at your Exchange mailbox level. Sometime another thing to be aware of is there's this thing called Azure Smart Lockout, which basically does an analysis of like password spraying, and then tries to lock out endpoints that it thinks are doing password spraying, and there's some heuristics around that, but it's fairly easy to bypass. So because it locks in on like IP addresses, but if you have like a proxy that rotates IP addresses with MSOL sprays, pretty easy to get around Smart Lockout. So just something to be aware of if you implement a Smart Lockout and you think you're safe from this attack. Okay, so now a little bit, we're gonna do a little bit of a survey of Azure Authentication. So this is the stuff that the identity management piece of Azure AD. There's some different ways of configuring it. You can do password hash synchronization. This is with your local Windows domain environment. There's pass-through authentication as well, which is basically forces the authentication rather than through Azure, forces the authentication to your Windows domain. So that's configured with ADFS. So the authentication actually happens locally at your domain level rather than at the Azure level. And then I think that can be flipped back to Azure if you're having problems with your local domain. So yeah, you can also do certificate-based authentication, which we touched upon in the service principal discussion. There's these things called conditional access policies, which you can create to have certain conditions, and like always require MFA for this group. It's a much of conditional type of policy which is customized for certain scenarios. The interesting thing about this, and I think I have some touch on it a little bit later, is that if you implement conditional access policies, it disables the baseline security policy, which has some MFA for everyone required. So you got to be careful on how you configure stuff. Certain things get disabled when you start using conditional access policies. So you kind of have to re-implement some of the baselines. And then there's these long-term access tokens. Yeah, so which basically we configure. So another thing to be careful about, and these are the things that can get people in trouble if they're shared, leaked, checked into like source control, things like that. So password hash synchronization. This kind of synchronizes your AD domain passwords with Azure AD. It's implemented with Azure AD Connect. And now what happens is that users can authenticate to Office 365 with domain credentials. It'd be interesting to see how many people out there actually have password hash synchronization enabled, and if people don't, is there any reason why? Microsoft seems to think this is a really good idea, so just throwing that out there. Then there's password authentication, which requires that all authentication go through your local domain, and it's not controlled by Azure AD, and then you can also use your local. That means you can use your local domain credentials to SSO to apps in Azure, and I think it's a little bit stronger security, but requires a little bit more work on your on-prem side with ADFS and all that configuration stuff. So Azure AD Connect, so Azure AD Connect is a service account, which is granted passwords hash sync rights. And thing to be aware of, it never uses MFA, so by design, so it's an account that you have to be very, very careful with, especially on your Azure AD machine that runs the Azure AD Connect service. That machine should be highly locked down and monitored well. Azure AD Connect runs on Azure Sync, which is in the servers OU. This stuff you can see in your domain controller. The servers OU has 2 GPOs applied. There's the server baseline policy, which adds a server admins groups. And then there's a server config GPO, which is added, which has 3 server tier groups with modified rights. So those are the permissions that are added to your domain via this Azure AD Connect service. So some attack options for Azure AD Connect. You basically you want to compromise the account that is a member of the server admins group or any of the server tier groups. That will give you the ability to basically sort of control Azure AD Connect. Also, you can compromise an account with delegated rights to modify groups in a group OU. So any of those 2 permission types, or member types, or account with that type of rights, you want to keep an eye on. And there's in previous presentations we had talked about auditing this through something like Bloodhound, so cover that. But you can find these accounts and see what attack paths are these accounts. It's good to know about it. Just a little bit about sort of enumerating objects, AD objects, both on-prem and Azure ADs. That any AD user, and this is on an on-prem AD, any AD user can enumerate all user accounts and admin group memberships with network access to a domain controller. So any authenticated user in your domain can basically enumerate group memberships, groups, and all the basics of that. In Azure AD, any Azure AD user can enumerate all user accounts. So if one account is compromised or control, access is leaked. And on on-prem AD, you have to have network access to domain control, which is not very common, especially on the internet. But in Azure AD, any user can enumerate all user accounts and admin memberships with access to Office 365 services, which is the internet. And user enumeration of IDs is possible with no account access as well, as we touched upon earlier. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, that comes back to the dangers of password spraying and the importance of understanding, keeping an eye on user access and user privilege, failed logins, that kind of stuff. Keeping an eye on that activity is critical. So a little bit about ADFS. We sort of started touching on it. So ADFS cannot authenticate directly to the MS Online portal. So it doesn't deal with Microsoft Online, the O365 stuff. It stores credentials on premises. It federates trust between Azure and on-prem AD to authenticate access to the cloud. Attacks. One thing that is, if you have the pass-through configured, attacks require authenticating to on-prem ADFS portal rather than Azure endpoints, which I think if you have a local Windows environment, this gives you some extra security because they can't just do that at the Azure level. And then you can also look at the ADFS request with the proxy. So if somebody gets into your environment, they can grab connections through a proxy. Let's see here. Hey, Amir, how much time? What's the time looking like right now?
I'm not sure. Cindy, what time this presentation?
About 7 minutes.
7 minutes.
Okay, I have to be done in 7 minutes. Okay.
No, that's okay. You can take another 10, 15 minutes if you want.
Okay. Right. So Azure AD Connect interaction with yeah. Hold on 1 second here. Okay. So this is a service that you can configure with Microsoft, and it's an Azure AD Connect Health and with ADFS, and these are some of the things that you can find out about. Alerts about common ADFS issues, certs expiring, missing updates, performance, etc. Bad password attempts, risky IPs, and then the Smart Lockout, which is available for 2016, 2019 domain Windows domain controllers. So yeah, something to look into. I think it's very useful to configure in your Azure environment. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's for someone of a premium subscription level, but something to definitely look into. All right. So we touched on this briefly. Conditional access policies. This is sort of how you build certain access attempts, and then what happens if an access attempt is made. Basically, you can. So as we said, you can force MFA for certain scenarios that are important. Actually, the security defaults that come with if you configure it requires MFA, blocks legacy protocols, and then protects privileged activities. So this is another thing. If you implement conditional access policies, all these defaults get disabled, and you have to make sure that you have conditional access policies in place for MFA and things like that. So just some of the things about it. Fine-grained conditional access policies are basically fine-grained controls for access to resources, when and where MFA is applied, and then it's basically uses a user agent to apply policies. So sometimes if the user agent, in devices, if the user agent is modified or something like that, you can bypass these conditional access policies. So you have to be careful about that. There's a nice little tool called MFA Sweep, which validates your conditional access policies, especially anything that you're doing with MFA. There's a link to the tool. It also has some checks for ADFS configurations, and can attempt to log into your on-prem ADFS as well to see if you have things configured correctly. But it does quite a few MFA checks on all these different services that are listed here. Highly recommended that you test this in your environment to make sure that your policies are correct, especially for MFA. So pretty important. Okay, so if we're in Azure Portal, yeah, as I said, you can get Azure AD info with PowerShell commandlets or Azure CLI. And so you can actually lock this down with that permission setting in Azure AD, so that authenticated users can't just go and like sort of enumerate all the objects. So that's a nice little setting that can be set. Not sure how many people have set that, but something to look into. So we have, so as I said before, some PowerShell modules, Azure AD and MS Online. These all have full management interaction with Azure AD and Office 365. Because of this strong capability anywhere on the internet, be careful with access tokens and scripts. Used by scripts and checked it to GitHub, etc. Azure AD user attributes. Also, you want to sort of audit your Azure AD user attributes, and there's actually a PowerShell one-liner that actually does that. It looks at the properties. A lot of times people put credentials in these Azure AD user attributes for support reasons. So something to look into and audit. Those are just some steps there to connect to MS Online and to enumerate these properties for all your users. So there's been some other things that happen. There's service principal hijacking, which basically there's 200 default service principals and an Office 365 tenant that a lot of people don't know about. Any of these can be hijacked, and they have quite a wide-ranging set of privileges. There's also key vaults. This is where people store secrets, and these are also high value targets. And so another thing to make sure that it's locked down well and well audited. Okay, and then we'll get into some tooling here, security test tooling that you can use to sort of audit the environment as sort of to end everything. This is a list of tools. I'm just going to very quickly cover each tool and just a little bit about what it does, and then people can feel free to go ahead and use them in your environment. We also use these tools in our pen testing engagements, and which we will be also offering with people with Azure and AD as well. We'll include that as these environment has become more as environment becomes more in use. So Scout Suite is a really good general purpose tooling. It works with AWS, Azure, and GCP. It gives you a good baseline as to your environment and tells you about the glaring problems in your configuration. It's a nice little tool, very useful to run and regularly, so that you kind of get all the low-hanging security fruit buttoned up. These road tools is a little bit more technical engineering sort of focused tool, but it's there to sort of analyze and enumerate the Azure AD environment. It basically can, when it logs in, if you can log in with the user, it'll use all that user's permissions to completely enumerate and create a sort of a database of everything in Azure AD. And then you can query that. So this is very useful for both attackers and also for self-auditing, just so that you can get a kind of a perspective as to what's in your Azure AD, how things are configured, and how it all sort of fits. All the permissions fit together. There's another tool called PowerShell, which also has a ton of functionality for enumerating and interacting with Azure resources. And it's very simple to use. It just all you need is an access token in the .azure file, and then using the access token, they can get into stuff, read, find you do enumeration, like change resources, all kinds of stuff. Also has built-in functionality to strip out credentials from key vaults, and it's very specific commands just for that. So just something or some of the tooling out there for hackers, and also for people to audit their environments. Another one of these tools is MicroBurst, which is very similar to PowerShell. Another great toolkit for analyzing the Azure environment. Has that link over there actually has tutorials on how to attack Azure. It's all well documented. So this is the kind of stuff attackers do. So if you're interested in this, it's worth kind of skimming through and taking a look at what type of attacks are out there, and then you can focus on making sure you have proper control techniques to protect yourself. AzureHound is also this is a classic tool, which Bloodhound, which was it's just very famous in the Windows directory, Active Directory space for self-auditing and for pen testing. This is a module that takes all the information from your Azure environment and then puts it into the Bloodhound graph. Another excellent tool to look into. This is just talk a little bit about it. It uses Azure PowerShell module and Azure AD module for gathering data. Gathers all the data. You can visualize the whole entire Azure environment. All those attack services that we discussed earlier. Can you basically have a graphical representation of it. Take a look. So once you install the AZ module, then you can just run the tool. I guess I didn't put in how to run the tool here. So anyway, what is documented at the AzureHound site. So it's just a simple PowerShell script. So another thing AzureHound can do, it can grab access tokens from compromised machines. So when an attacker gets access to a machine that has logged into Azure, it has functionality to pull out those existing files under the Azure RM context settings JSON and token cache that, and then basically grabs that stuff. Also, it pulls it has functionality to pull the access tokens out of the DLL files that are installed locally on a machine that interacts with Azure environment, and then that JWT token that's extracted can be decoded, and then and you can also get the user principal name and tenant ID from it as well, by decoding the JWT. Okay, I guess I did put it just in the slide. Basically, to use Azure AHound, basically just you invoke Azure AD is just a simple PowerShell thing. Then it creates a zip file, and then you can also use it to collect data from different tenant IDs with the switch. So it's really useful for just collecting, enumerating AD information, and even if you have multiple tenants in place. So protection advice. So phishing protections. This is a little bit of a summary of what you should have in place. So you should monitor Azure AD logs. You want to pull logs from your Azure AD Graph API. This can all be pulled into Splunk. There's also Azure Event Hub, which is available also. I don't know. Actually, Dan, if you're still on the call, does the tooling you discussed, does that interact with Azure Event Hub at all? Or is that part of it, or is that separate?
Yeah, I believe it does, as long as you configure the integration with Azure.
Okay, all right, interesting. Anyway, yeah. So this is just something I think some of the tooling that Dan discussed can do, but for the ones that don't have it, you should audit your consented permissions for all apps, and this is kind of how you do it. You go into Enterprise Apps, you click on permissions, then you go through and you list the admin consented permissions and the permission rating. You review consents that are all of consent type, all principals. This is just a checklist of the checks you should make for your apps to make sure that there's nothing suspicious or out of whack in the security settings. You really want to look at specific users that have consents granted and check the consents if it's high. And then also there's a script that Microsoft publishes. It's called Get Azure AD Permissions, and you can run that and it'll dump all this for you. And so you can review it in that instead of having to go click through the portal. So it's kind of nice. Yeah, so another important items to keep in mind: treat ADFS or Azure AD Connect as a tier 0 resource. Make sure that you have MFA for all admins, especially global admins. In fact, I don't have the link here, but Microsoft has a presentation on this, and they've even today only globally only 12% of global admins have MFA enabled, and it increases by a couple percentage points every year. So there's something to think about.
Are you almost finished or wrapping?
Yeah, we've got a couple more slides.
Okay, so we want to take our, as soon as we can wrap.
Yeah, just give me like 1 or 2 more minutes. I'll just quickly go through this. Yeah, so conditional access or based on policy of admins. Get the Azure AD Privilege Identity Management license. Gives you a bunch of identity management functionality, which is really useful. There's also the FIDO2 Global Administrator capability, which adds some extra permissions and capability to Global Administrator. There's Microsoft provides leaked credential reporting. I think that comes with the PIM setting. And then on internal breach, you can also flip your authentication to Azure AD only. This gives you the ability to clean up. Especially like if something like a ransomware attack happens or something like that, you have the ability to have authentication going on even if your internal environment is down. So key takeaways is that audit your Azure AD environment. There's plenty of tooling available. If you don't do it, the attackers will for you. There's lots of good tools available, and then we will also be releasing in our lab environment is nearly complete. We'll be releasing some labs shortly, like in about a week, I think it looks like right now. And then in the next few months, we're also going to have a lot of this covered in Azure AD Lab as well. So that's all I have.